Welcome to the Executive Innovation Show podcast, where we bring you real executive conversations with industry game changers and thought leaders. We ask the questions you're thinking, what you're scared to ask, and we make your brain hurt afterward. With your host, Carrie Chitsey Wells, co-founder and CEO of One Touch Video Chat, live video interviews, and the nonprofit Humans Helping Humans.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's podcast, another nonprofit special that we're having today. It's called There's No D and PTSD, Warrior Trauma Prevention. I'm here with my co-host today, Daniel Miller, COO of Human Helping Human. Daniel, how are you?
Doing really great. Excited to get started.
Awesome. And we have an amazing guest with us today, Philip Folsom. He's the co-founder of the SPARTA Suicide Prevention Program for Warriors. He's a veteran himself. Philip has had game-changing tools to help improve the lives of over 500,000 individuals over the past 25 years. He's been in a ton of publications, has his own, does podcasts, videos. You might have seen him on national TV shows like Biggest Loser and Celebrity Fitcamp. Philip, welcome to the show.
All right. Hey, great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Awesome. Well, we are so happy to have you. Philip, let's tell the listeners a little bit about your backstory. What made you start SPARTA? How did you get into it and really helping veterans and first responders?
Great. Great question. My background is pretty classic high pre-trauma, which that's the chronic series of, kind of negative crap that we all have growing up. It's poverty and neglect. And it turns out that most veterans have roughly 2 to 3 times the amount of pre-trauma as the average civilian, which means that the military is, as opposed to being purely a patriotic service-based function, which it is that as well, it's also a means of escaping your situation and finding some structure and efficacy that you can have to be able to change your life. And so my background was classic pre-trauma of a lot of poverty and adversity growing up. And I went into the Army at 17. And when I got out, my experiences in the military, that it can be equated as sloshing an already full cup. And that sloshing ends up kind of splashing all over on the people that we love, our family and our friends and coworkers. And a lot of times that's how people experience post-traumatic stress from those of us who had it. And it was brought to my attention in grad school, actually, that I had some things that I had to shore up with my life. And that was given to me very lovingly and robustly by a mentor of mine. And I knew that it was true. I just didn't know that anybody else saw it, which is probably what a lot of us people with some mental or emotional challenges have, is that we think we're doing a really good job disguising and hiding and avoiding. But the reality is, when you walk into the room, you kind of have a sense of who's safe, who's healthy, who's functional. And so I started a sort of a modern day vision quest, actually, of how do I fix myself? How do I put some rebar in the cement? How do I discover what's going on with my brain and my soul and all the rest of that? And that led me to the awareness that it wasn't just me that was messed up. And we all have our secret demons, and we all have challenges, and we all have this imposter syndrome. And that opened up a door to, I had now a new way of serving. And that was to be able to provide a lot of the other people that I ran into with some of this really life-changing or maybe life-saving experience, information, and technology. And this is what I've been doing for 25 years. It's not over yet.
Yeah, well, you have paved the way and have, an amazing program. And I think, we talk a lot about, as a country, we talk a lot about, veteran suicide or veteran addiction. And, a lot of people are, trying to solve it. But what are the numbers of, combat deaths versus, suicide when veterans are back home? So we kind of, give the span to the audience that's listening.
It's a really interesting dynamic, and this might be an eye-opener for a lot of you who are listening who don't actually know any combat veterans. And right now we're running at, our military in general is less than 1% of our population. So as opposed to previous generations where at some point you you knew veterans and you welcomed them home because it was a community dynamic. I mean, we all, at some point in World War II, we all knew families that had men and women who were out there fighting, and you tied that yellow ribbon around the oak tree to, as that welcome home. And it was a community effect, which we'll get into in a minute, how important that is in processing trauma. But we don't know really many veterans. And most of us don't even realize that we're at war right now because it's not in the newspaper. It's not on news. It's not on your social media. We don't even realize that we have men and women in harm's way overseas right now, and we have in the last 10 years. So in our most recent experience of war since 9/11, we've lost under 8,000 troops to combat. And we've done a really good job actually at saving the lives of combat troops. Our medical technology and response is never been better. So that number is remarkably low for how many battlefronts we have been in and are currently in. The scary number is that compare and contrast the 8,000 deaths to combat since 9/11 to the 150,000 suicide deaths since 9/11. It is catastrophic. It is epidemic. We are losing well over the regular publicized 22 a day number, because that's just classic suicides of I left a note and put a gun in my mouth. So we're really losing much more than that if you factor in suicide by cop, all the intentional vehicular deaths and overdoses. So the veteran conversation is an absolute catastrophe of mental health of our culture. And that in itself should be enough to kind of wake up and go, holy cow. But the veterans are more important than that because they function as the canary in the coal mine of the mental health landscape of America. So what's happening to veterans now is going to be happening to all of our police and our fire department and all our first responders and all the kids who are growing up in high pre-trauma, such as inner cities. We're seeing suicide rates skyrocketing even as early as middle school. And not to mention the epidemic clinical anxiety, depression. We're not doing great with our mental health right now. And the suicides in veterans are, you could equate them as kind of like the polar bear in the Arctic. It's like everybody can see what's going on with the polar bear. But that trophic cascade underneath, it represents the health of that ecosystem. If the polar bears are doing okay, then you've got a whole, there's 1,000 species under that are doing okay. And the veterans kind of represent that tip of the spear because there's not many duty, services that have that much trauma related to it. So that's the scary numbers, 150,000 and counting. Wow. We're going to lose a couple veterans by the end of this podcast.
Wow. That's pretty incredible and just a really devastating statistic to even think about. So, Philip, I know you've been really vocal about the word PTSD. And the title of this podcast is There's No D in PTSD. Could you kind of explain why we should call it PTS versus PTSD?
The D is designated for disorder, which means that there's something wrong with you. And the reality is that post-traumatic stress is not a disorder. It is a perfect adaptation to taking a human being and dropping them into an ongoing, protracted, chronic, high-stress environment. So human beings are just evolutionarily incredibly well adapted to dealing with short-term acute stress. And even if they're just terrible events that have happened, which are, death and epic things, we have a way of processing that. And at a hormonal level, that stress really triggers a lot of cortisol and norepinephrine and adrenaline. And those are designed to make us hyper vigilant and very aware and focused enough that we can navigate through these life-changing or life-threatening events. What we are not designed for is long-term, chronic, relentless stress, such as people who are on the battlefield for months at a time. And so what happens is when you drop a human being into that place of chronic stress, it would be like lowering a human into a cave filled with tigers. and going, okay, we'll see you in a couple months. Well, that human is not going to be the same human because he's going to have to learn how to survive in the cave with tigers. And what it's going to do to him is going to make him hypervigilant. It's going to make him express and demonstrate a whole bunch of perfectly adapted behaviors for the tiger cave, but they're not well adapted. In fact, they're maladaptive to going back into society. So take that same veteran and drop him back into civilian America, and all of a sudden, those perfect adaptations that allowed him or her to survive on that, high-speed battlefield tempo are now looked at as a disorder, and they're really not. So our veterans are not broken; they're just wounded, and we have a tendency to not want to deal with that in the same way we don't want to realize that we're at war right now and that we're losing men and women right now, and because it's an ugly, scary thing, and so we don't want to take on our burden, our share of that trauma. So when we see a veteran, we like to just say, thank you for your service. And I'd like to invite everybody to kind of maybe go one step beyond the thank you for your service, because for a lot of us, that feels like a dismissal. It's kind of like, hey, thanks for what you did. And now here's your GI Bill and move on. Really what we need to do is find a better way to welcome them home and then say, hey, we're going to carry some of the burden of the trauma that we asked you to go do for us. And this is the same thing we really should be doing for all of our police and our fire and the rest of the people that carry those heavy loads of dark, shadowy things that we don't normally want to carry on our day to day. So one of the ways is to remove the stigma of the disorder and just say, hey, we put you in some hard situations for a long, hard time, and now welcome home. Let's sort it out.
Yeah, no, I think that's, the one thing that you said when we had chatted before, the thank you for your service, that really got me thinking and, thinking about how veterans relate so much better to other veterans that have been in their shoes and, maybe been in combat in a different location, but they understand what they went through. And you talk a lot about the tribes concept and relating that, and use wolves even in some of your treatment. And it, when you explain it, it makes so much sense. But I think just if you could tell us a little bit about kind of the wolf concept and the traveling impacts and getting people back into society. I think a lot of people, may not relate the two, but when you describe it, it makes so much sense.
Yeah, I'll cite my co-founder to the SPARTA project, Dr. Michael Salonius, and he was in the military in Israel. And one of the interesting things we noticed there, and their situation geographically and historically places them in a societal high alert nonstop. However, they actually are showing remarkable low levels of post-traumatic stress and suicide. And you wouldn't think that would be the case, but the reason why that Israel has got such a low suicide rate is that everyone serves. Everyone is involved. And, one of the big dynamics of post-traumatic stress that's leading to suicide is that you take the chronic pre-trauma, and then you add the acute wartime trauma of terrible events and happening. And then a lot of times that final death stroke is having a moral injury, which is, I saw something, experienced something that was really bad and questionable, and I have no way of discharging that shame. And shame is an important piece related to all of our lives because it's very different than guilt. Guilt is something that I feel bad about personally, and I can generally work through that. But shame, I cannot ever process or discharge shame if I'm isolated. I need a tribe. So in Israel, since everybody's participating in this, they all carry a portion of that trauma, and then the shame gets dissipated. So you don't have that big moral injury load of I'm isolated, and that's the beginning of the death spiral. And we're designed to be pack animals. We're built for collaboration. And when we are with our tribe, we, instead of having all these stress hormones like cortisol, we're now releasing serotonin and all these well-being hormones that actually make us feel good and give us a sense of well-being. And when you're, embedded in a tribe system such as the military, we're actually not seeing incredibly high levels of suicide of actively deployed men and women. It's when they get isolated, when they get dropped back into society, is when you see all the toxic churn begin to happen. And one of my favorite quotes is by Krishnamurti. He's a philosopher, and it is no measure of health to be well adapted to a profoundly sick society. So our society is no longer oriented along tribal systems or kinship-based systems. We're now in these big, giant mega cities where we're running in career-based organizations, and that makes us feel very isolated. And that isolation is really the primary cause of most of our diseases that we are experiencing. So, when you look at all these chronic issues of diabetes and heart disease and hypertension and anxiety and depression, they all can be traced back to chronic stress, such as cortisol, and that causes inflammation over the long term. So we need our tribe. We need our that interconnected, collaborative, really safe social structure to make us feel good. And the military has it, and our civilian world does not. And so we're not really doing a good job either across the board. And I thought at some point I will bring veterans out to go see a wolf sanctuary, because in my mind there was going to be some kind of continuity, maybe a mutual healing of kind of misrepresented, somewhat scary, stigmatized animals, right? Here's the combat veterans and here's wolves. And I work with a wonderful nonprofit wolf rescue and rehabilitation program called apexprotectionproject.org. And they rescue and rehabilitate all these wolves and wolf dogs that people get because they want to be Jon Snow in Game of Thrones. And then they realize, holy cow, I've got a wolf on my hands. And they just chain them up in the backyard. And so the chained up wolf and the isolated veteran have remarkably similar characteristics. And how they heal their wolves is they put them in an existing healthy pack. And that pack is actually the healing process, which is the same thing that we try to do at SPARTA. Is we gather combat veterans from all across the different veterans organizations, and we bring them to a camp for a 5.5-day war detox deep dive into healing, and the veterans heal each other. I think we do a good job of creating the container and providing psychoeducation and information and experiences, but really they heal each other. And my first experience bringing these veterans out to the wolves was we got out of the van and I see two wolves just immediately erupt in this big dog fight. And I was like, holy cow, this might have been a bad idea. And, in my experience of dealing with dogs, you try to separate them as quickly as possible because, they're trying to kill each other or at least hurt each other. That's how dogs fight. And the wolf handler, named Steve Wastel, one of my good best friends now, he's leaning against a tree drinking a cup of coffee. And he said, oh, don't worry about it, Philip. This is just what they do. He said, they're pack hunters. They can't afford to bite each other, so they never do. And I said, they're not biting each other? He goes, no. And immediately they finished their little altercation, and then they kind of licked each other and ran off playing. So what the wolves demonstrate for us is when we are in a collaborative, interconnected organization, whether that be a tribe or a pack, we need each other, and we shouldn't treat each other as the other. We should treat each other as extensions of ourselves, because that's what a family is. That's what a pack is. It's what a tribe is. It's what a sports team is. It's what a church is. This is how we're designed to operate. It makes us feel good. It makes us healthy, happy, high performing. And if we need each other, we cannot afford to bite each other. And if we don't bite each other, all of a sudden we feel safe. And that means that we can express our conflict with each other and our truth and our pain. And that's the thing that allows us, that healthy conflict allows us to discharge all that trauma. And really that's one of the secrets of we need to build our tribes. And that is true for everybody who's listening to this. You don't have to be a combat veteran. You need to have good friends. You need to have coworkers that are more than just work. So it is of our absolute survival that we do that.
Yeah, building our tribes. I think that's really, really quite interesting and really unique work. Bringing the wolves and almost treating returned veterans and teaching them about packs and tribes and how that works. I want to ask about aftercare. And, aftercare is really important after they've gone through the process, they're with the tribes and the wolf packs and the veterans have experienced that. What are your thoughts on aftercare? Does it work well? Does it not work well? What kind of things are you seeing?
That's a really astute and powerful question. I also work in a lot of rehabs and substance abuse issues, and the level of recidivism, people who relapse, is deep into the 90%.
Yeah, wow. So high.
So rehabs, it doesn't work. And I'm not trying to put a bummer on anybody, but unless you have found a way to integrate the lessons from wherever you're going and whatever you're doing, then you're going to drop back to baseline. And because that baseline is set, and that the baseline is, it's your hormonal level, it's your social structure, it's your habits, it's the story, the narrative that you have about yourself. It's a complex thing, your baseline of behavior, but that's the thing that needs to move, and no amount of intervention is going to change that. And so one of the analogies we use at SPARTA is, we sort of connect the experience as putting a cast on a broken arm. And we go, all right, guys, they say we're broken and we're putting a cast on. Does the cast fix you? And everybody goes, no, I guess it doesn't. So what fixes you when you break your arm? Well, you have to fix you. And this means that, we can do a good job building the container, and we can provide as much nutrition and safety and structure and coaching and all this good stuff. But at some point, the healing process is an internal game. And so it happens in two primary functions if we want to create long-term sustainable change. And the first one is you got to upgrade your operating system as a human, and that means change your habits. And it takes 30 days to create a new habit. And even then, you still have to be vigilant about sliding back into old patterns. And it takes 90 days to create a new lifestyle. So that 90 days is kind of the magic number of when you get enough reps in 90 days, and you can start seeing a little bit of efficacy and change. But even then, the numbers are fairly low. The second big variable to creating effective long-term change is accountability. And this comes externally from people who are integrally involved and connected to your journey, your process. So teach the veterans, we need to affect your habits, and we need to change your humans. Those are the two things. Habits and humans are what creates sustainable long-term transformation. And we do the best we can with our limited resources and time to network and get them connected. But at some point, they have to take the ball and run with it, and they have to be able to build healthy accountability organizations back home in Kansas, right? Because we're taking them to Oz, but we all go back to Kansas at some point. And you have to be able to remember some of those lessons in Oz if you're going to make Kansas different for yourself.
Yeah, it's so interesting. It's so funny because you quote so many awesome people. Now I feel like I'm going to be quoting you. You've had so much wisdom today that has made so much sense. So it has been so great having you and talking about just so much, awesome insights into really how to look at veterans and first responders and trauma. It has been a pleasure to have you on the show. everybody go check out the SPARTAproject.org. That's Philip's nonprofit. They are doing some amazing things. They have some amazing pictures of a lot of the residential and programs that they have. And they just do so much awesome stuff outside the box that really work. Philip told us the other day that they haven't had a veteran suicide on their watch. And so they must be doing something very amazing. So we want you to keep up to the great work and great stuff that you're doing, Philip, and we will be following your journey for sure.
Thank you, Carrie. It was an absolute pleasure and honor, and I deeply appreciate the opportunity to get not only the wisdom and healing out, but want to encourage if anybody has resources or you need to work off any karma, please jump in and give us a hand, because we're all we're going as hard as we can, and we love your support.
Absolutely. And if you guys have any questions about today's podcast, please submit those or submit any questions to Philip. Please remember to rate and review the podcast and give us any questions that you have today. Go check out the SPARTAproject.org and follow Philip. He has some awesome stuff on there, so you're going to want to not forget about that. And to go follow Daniel, go to helpinghumans.care and follow Daniel's Humans Helping Humans journey as well.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Have a great day.
Thanks, Carrie.
This podcast has come to a close. To hear more from the Executive Innovation Show podcast, subscribe, submit questions, and share the love. Follow us on social. We're everywhere.